During this legislative session, a House panel advanced a bill limiting ICE activity in Virginia. Also, Governor Spanberger ends ICE agreement involving Virginia State Police and corrections officers. It's Stay the Water. I'm your host, Eric Cavill, and you're joining us for our discussion of melting the ice, limiting enforcement in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Once again, we'd like to thank you for joining us, as you always do, as we broadcast from the campus of the Norfolk State University, home of the Spartan Nation, from none other than WSB Hot 91, the soul of VA. As we have continued our discussion during our 2026 General Assembly series, we're discussing bills and actions by the House, the Senate, and also by the governor's office as it impacts you in your community, in your city, in our Commonwealth, and yes, also in our country. You know, there's no other issue that is gripping our nation right now other than ICE. ICE, of course, is our immigration and customs and enforcement agency that has always existed. However, under the Trump administration, ICE is now taking on glimpses of a Gestapo. It is enforcing the law very heavy-handedly. It's changing the rules right before our eyes. And we're seeing it happen, and we're seeing the results of it with 2 killings of U.S. citizens in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Well, one thing about the ICE across the country, as we see winter hits, of course, we've all had a little snow. We've had a lot more than we wanted. But ICE is also spreading across every community here in the country. Just recently, for those of you that watch the news and have seen the reports, social media, we saw arrests happening by ICE in Virginia Beach. You know, we've seen, these individuals show up around universities. And again, what we're finding is that the enforcement and the heavy-handedness and the executing the law by changing the rules and making it okay is really upending the way that the public sees our law enforcement and also how our law enforcement sees our citizens. But again, this is all because of one administration and how they're changing the rules. One thing I want to address as well, not just what we're doing here in Virginia, but also in the second half, we're going to take a look at how many ICE arrests actually end up being what the president said would be violent criminal records and what those documents actually show. As a matter of fact, we'll talk about it now, and then we'll take a look at what's happening in Virginia. Now, according to CBS News, article just last week noted that according to reports, less than 14% of those arrested by ICE in Trump's first year back in office had violent criminal records. Now, when we take a look at this, now these are according to an internal document from the Department of Homeland Security obtained by CBS News. Now, the official statistics, according by CBS News, contained in the DHS document, or Department of Homeland Security, had not been previously reported publicly, but they provide the most detailed look yet into who ICE has arrested during the Trump administration, far-reaching deportation operations across the country. Now, of course, our president said that, according to these figures, they undermine those assertions that the president said it will crack down on illegal immigration, primarily targeting dangerous and violent criminals living in the U.S. illegally. People that our President Trump, and his lieutenants have regularly called, quote unquote, the worst of the worst. However, according to these statistics, it shows that ICE has dramatically increased arrests since President Trump's return to office, and we look at this happen. Now, according to the statistics by DHS, these are their stats. We look at the internal documents about immigration officials. They're targeting murderers and rapists and gangsters, but the internal document indicates that less than 2% of those arrested by ICE over the past year had homicides or sexual assault charges or convictions. Another 2% of those taken into ICE custody are accused of being gang members. So we're talking about 4% now that we're looking at violent crimes. But nearly 40% of those arrested by ICE in the president's first year in office did not have any criminal record at all. And they were only accused of civil immigration offenses, such as living in the U.S. illegally or overstaying their permission to be in the country, according to documentation. But those alleged violation of U.S. immigration CEDs. So what we're showing now is that those individuals who have been arrested, they're not being arrested for just those violent crimes that was mentioned, but they're all being arrested for all types of things, and some with no records at all. 40%, as a matter of fact. But according to a CBS poll, they found that America's support for the president's deportation efforts have fallen to 46%, down from 59%. Now, this is just over 6% of those just surveyed said immigration agents were being also too tough. So we're going to go back and take a look at these numbers again in just a moment. But I just wanted to note that, because when you add it all up, we got a lot of people that don't fall into those categories that are being arrested and released, or arrested for non-criminal charges. Some that are arrested for those violent charges. So once again, these are the stats. These are the Department of Homeland Security. These are their statistics. Now let's look at what our state, the Commonwealth of Virginia, has done. Now, first I want to take a look at what the House did, and then also what our governor has done as well. Now, this particular package, when we look at the House panel advancing a bill limiting ICE activity in Virginia, this package will require judicial warrants for courthouse arrests and restrict immigration enforcement in schools, polling places, and other public spaces. Now, we all saw the 5-year-old kid that was taken out of school by armed, masked ICE agents and taken to a facility where we know that he eventually ended up with his father. They were released, but this was after a big outcry and outpouring. We're talking about a kindergarten. Now, again, just kind of imagine your kindergarten, your 5-year-old in a situation like that, how that would feel. Just take out the circumstances. How do you explain that to your 5-year-old? And how would that 5-year-old child feel? So when we take a look at what Virginia has done in a House of Delegates, a Democratic House subcommittee, they advanced this bill. Now, with this, the measures, many of which were consolidated because of overlapping goals, they went to the full House Public Safety Committee. Now, taken together, these bills, once again, will require judicial warrants for certain civil immigration arrests in courthouses and other public facilities. And they will restrict enforcement in polling places and also limit cooperation between state and local enforcement and federal immigration authorities, and impose new penalties on officers who conceal their identity or impersonate federal agents. Now, this has become a problem, obviously. But the subcommittee action comes amid heightened scrutiny of ICE activity, as we just mentioned, across the Commonwealth, including reports of masked or identified agents conducting civil arrests in and around courthouses cited by lawmakers. Now, the court arrests are a shift from prior federal policy. That's, of course, we all know, it's drawn criticism from not just Democrats and immigration rights advocates, but now even the Republicans are turning to start questioning these efforts. There are reports of individuals who are obeying their court orders and going through the immigration process and basically showing up at court to go through the immigration process. However, they're being accosted and arrested at the courthouse, even though they're going through the process. Once again, reports across the country of what's actually happening, and as opposed to what was said would happen. Now, when we take a look at the courthouse arrests and the broad enforcement packet, one of these bills would prohibit most civil arrests in courthouses without judicial warrant or order that shield people required to attend court along with their family members, witness and other accompany them from civil arrests while traveling to, attending, or leaving court proceedings. In other words, just because you come into court doing the right thing and going back home doing the right thing, ICE can't arrest you because you're doing the right thing. But since January 2025, ICE has reversed longstanding policies and started ramping up warrantless civil and administrative arrests in the courthouses. So you're showing up to do the right thing, but you're getting arrested. Now, according to Delegate Katrina Cowson, Democrat out of Albemarle, She said agents have appeared sometimes masked, often identified, creating confusion for court personnel and fear among victims and witnesses. Now, imagine if you are a court officer, this happens, people come in. Of course, they're federal agents, so federal law trumps local, but at the same time, we do have local rules, state rules, and, and your mask, you don't know who they're coming after. It just creates a lot of chaos. So this would protect and shield chaos from happening. But according to the delegates, that if people are afraid to come to court, it hurts us all, which it does. So because of their similar scope, lawmakers voted to merge several other proposals into this bill. Once again, this is with schools and polling areas as well. Now, Delegate Irene Shin, Democrat out of Fairfax, will require public K-12 schools to notify parents and staff if federal immigration enforcement officers are present on school property, and would bar access to non-public school areas without a judicial warrant. Once again, you just can't come on school property, K-12, without letting at least parents know. How would you feel if federal activity, any type of law enforcement activity was happening and they didn't notify you? Just like when guns are found at school or things of that nature, there's a disruption or maybe something is happening. We get notified as parents that something is happening. Their delegates are saying the same thing should happen with ICE, right? So when we take a look at what's happening, according to Delegate Shin, she said, it seems pretty a crazy time to go and prey on vulnerable communities. Basically what's happening. Now, there's another delegate, our local delegate, Delegate Jackie Glass. Her measure was folded into this, which largely mirrors Cowson's courthouse protections. But Glass says similar laws have already withstood federal challenges in other courts. She said they defended themselves against the federal government, speaking of New York, so there's proof that this can actually work. Two other bills from Delegate Alfonso Lopez, Democrat out of Arlington, were also merged into the courthouse proposal, HB 1440 and 1442. One would bar immigration enforcement activity within 40 feet of polling places, election board meetings, or recount sites. Also, it would prohibit federal immigration enforcement in non-public spaces like protected areas like schools, hospitals, Commonwealth's Attorney's Office, other facilities designated by the Attorney General, unless a judicial warrant or subpoena is provided. Only makes sense, right? So when you take a look at this, Delegate Lopez said, basically the Commonwealth has a right and duty to ensure that we have free and fair elections. Polling places are restrictions. So this argument that immigration enforcement are near polling voting areas, it could intimidate eligible voters. And what do we have coming up this year? Midterm elections that could flip the House of Representatives. However, if you've got ICE agents at the door of polling places, who's going to want to come vote when you've got the possibility of being mistaken? Now, I gave you the stats earlier. There are people who have not committed any crimes, or people who are maybe in violation of civil, not criminal, or people that are actually going through the court process, or people that are going across anything. They're legal, but they're being accosted and arrested. Who wants to go through that? So what this bill does, it says, hey, you can go vote free and fair, so therefore you won't have to worry about that. There is a decline in a lot of public schools with a high immigrant population, whether it be first generation, even second generation, where they're not going to school because of that. And that is not a good thing. So when you look at, again, being protected from harassment by federal agents and community services like education, healthcare, legal assistance, it's the right thing to do. Not only that, but lawmakers also target officer anonymity and impersonation concerns as well. Now, of course, we know with those masks, anybody can impersonate federal officers. People do it without masks now. So this is a good bill that we look at, merging this again into one of those packages. Delegate Charlie Schmidt, Democrat out of Richmond, has a bill that would prohibit state and local law enforcement officers from wearing most facial coverings while performing their duties, with exception for health protection and SWAT operations. Now, health protections, of course, those are masks for individuals that want to shield themselves from these type of infectious diseases, the common flu, COVID. But a lot of individuals that support these measures are individuals that didn't wear masks anyway. So, it'll be interesting to see how many officers actually wear those masks for ICE. And also SWAT operations. which of course makes sense. That has been a part of the staple for a lot of those operations as well. But the bill would also require officers to visibly display identification and create criminal penalties and civil liability for those violations. Now, Representative Casa spoke in support, cited a December incident in which a masked individual posing as an ICE agent went door to door in Northern Virginia. This advocate said that when people can't tell the difference between real law enforcement and imposters, it creates fear, prevents them from seeking help when they need it, and I'll also say that it also prohibits real federal officers from doing their job lawfully. That's right. We want you to do your job, but these things prohibit you from doing so. In addition to that, Virginia Grassroots Coalition echoed those concerns, saying that anonymity undermines public trust, endangers public safety, hinders legitimate law enforcement operations. Delegate Shin's bill would also increase penalties for impersonating a federal law enforcement officer and elevating the offense to a felony. That's right. If you impersonate an officer now, it's not a felony. Go figure. There are also two bills addressing cooperation between Virginia law enforcement and federal immigration authorities. Now, these measures follows Governor Spanberger's Executive Order 12, which issued earlier this last week, which formally ended an agreement with the U.S. Customs and Immigration Enforcement that allowed Virginia State Police and state correctional officers to assist with federal immigration operations. Now, we're going to talk about that in just a moment. But I want us to take a look at a couple of Delegate Lopez and Delegate Elizabeth Guzman out of Prince William County Democrat. They actually put those bills up. As a matter of fact, it would prohibit state agencies from entering agreements that deputize officers as federal immigration agents and require existing agreements to be terminated by September 2026. And with that, it's Stay the Water. I'm your host, Eric LaVille, and you're joining us for our discussion of when the ice melts. Virginia limiting enforcement of ICE here in the Commonwealth. Both the House panel and the governor have instituted executive orders, and they have advanced bills in the legislature, which haven't become law yet, in order to limit ICE enforcement here in the Commonwealth, simply requiring judicial warrants for courthouse arrests, restricting immigration enforcement in schools, polling places, and other public spaces. Now, before that, we know that, a lot of this has been spoken of. First of all, it's just common sense legislation, right? And I wanted to mention earlier where these have not become law, right? So I know we're hearing a lot of misinformation, disinformation from other sides, and sometimes you may not understand it, because, again, the legislative process is not just an ABC, but you got to connect the dots. So one thing I want to get over to all listeners is that when a law goes through the process, it doesn't become law until it's signed by the governor and it has a date of execution, or where it becomes, which is usually July 1st, right? Unless there's something different like a special election or a special referendum that's being put up, that we'll see coming in April when we take a look at the redrawing of the districts. We talked about that last week. When we take a look at these bills advancing through the House, they have to go through the House first, and then they have to go to the floor and be voted on and the like. Once this package of bills are voted on and passed in the House of Delegates, it crosses over next week into the Senate. So crossover is when bills from the House cross over into the Senate, and bills from the Senate cross over into the House. We'll talk more about that next week when we take a look at crossover. But one thing I want to make sure we understand is that these packages, these bills that I mentioned, that were consolidated, protecting citizens from overarching and harassing tactics of current ICE enforcement based upon the antics that have been ramped up under this White House, and protecting Commonwealth of Virginia citizens from that and allowing individuals to go through the process. Now, it also protects the integrity of the process as well. We mentioned earlier that there are people that are impersonating law enforcement. We don't want that. You want individuals who are law enforcement, properly deputized, properly inducted into the law enforcement agency in which they're operating. We want them carrying out their duties, not imposters, because that undermines them. It undermines the legitimacy of the process and the like. But also we want public trust. Public trust is the centerpiece of law enforcement because it's a give and take. I trust you because you have that badge. I respect that badge. All citizens should, because that badge is something that's earned. And that badge is a level of public trust that's attached to it that you will protect and serve. Anyone who is privileged to wear it, they know that. Just like myself when I was in the military, I was privileged to wear that uniform. I knew my duties. So those that wear that badge, they have a privilege and a duty to protect and serve. And that comes with respect and public trust. However, when public trust is eroded, then there is a problem. That problem stems from overarching and harassing enforcement. That trust, public trust erodes when policies go against the Constitution. That public trust erodes when the public feels that they cannot put their 100% confidence in the process. So these bills actually help it. Now, what did Governor Spanberger do last week? Now, Governor Spanberger, of course, we know she signed Executive Order 12. And with that, she stated when she ended ICE agreement involving Virginia State Police and corrections officers, she stated that the partnership misused state resources. And Republicans, they said they warned of a federal backlash there. But Abigail Spanberger, Governor Spanberger, formally ended their agreement, and the agreement stems from former Governor Glenn Youngkin's administration, which had effectively placed state law enforcement under federal control and supervision to conduct civil immigration. All right. So our former governor gave the authority to the federal government of the state. But this is the party of states' rights. However, the right of the state was taken away and given to the federal government. But what this also did, it ended those agreements, which was a campaign promise, of course, of Governor Spanberger, when she said tasking state and local enforcement to help with law enforcement was a, quote, misuse of those resources, unquote. She also said, and this is according to the Virginia Mercury, by the way, that she'd rather see law enforcement focus on its core duties than serve as deputies to ICE. Also, when we discussed the House panel, we also were referencing the Virginia Mercury as well. With this builds upon Executive Order 12, which we know rescinded that. The order directed all state law enforcement agencies to review policies, training practices, ensure they align with standards of protecting human life, and to, quote, not engage in fear-based policing, enforcement theater, or actions that create barriers to people seeking assistance in their time of need, unquote. Now, Governor Spanberger also pointed to national conversations, which we started off with looking at the CBS News and the Department of Homeland Security statistics themselves from an internal document obtained exclusively by CBS News, but was not reported publicly. She pointed to these conversations around ICE tactics in a meeting with the news on week before last Wednesday. She said President Donald Trump's administration has had the agency hyper-focused on Minneapolis in recent weeks. Of course, I mentioned the two American citizens. I mentioned their names. Renee Good, who's a graduate of Old Dominion University here in Norfolk, Virginia, and Alex Preddy, who was a nurse at one of the military hospitals. They were killed by agents. And Governor Spanberger said that she believes that those deaths inspire her new order, but also she believes it helped to bring the conversation to the forefront. And no doubt, just like the murder of George Floyd. And who would have thought Minneapolis, Minnesota is ground zero for abusive law enforcement tactics. Minneapolis, Minnesota. We know about the Birmingham, Alabamas. We know about the Mississippis. We know about the Virginias. We know about, the Redwoods in Florida. We know about all these places of tradition. We know about the LA Rise. We know about Detroit. But Minneapolis, we know about New York, Minnesota. Who would ever thunk it? But it is ground zero. Governor Spanberger said she thinks it's extraordinarily important to make sure that we're celebrating and honoring and recognizing the strong vetting, training, high standards that we have here in the Commonwealth. We hold our law enforcement agencies too. She also said she wanted to make sure that we're making a clear line in the sand about what is expected of our law enforcement officials. She also said, drawing on, now keep in mind, our governor is a former federal law enforcement agent. Drawing on her background in law enforcement, she emphasized that the order is intended to reinforce accountability, public service, and also safety. Now, one thing that there's also another side to it. The other side is the Republican side. They believe that in their sharp, different view, according to Senator Glenn Studevert, Republican out of Chesterfield, said he believes the order reflects Spanberger's putting politics over public safety. I think that kind of falls on deaf ears given what has happened across the country. But he said as of late last year, the majority of thousands of people detained by ICE in Virginia had no criminal histories. This is according to Virginia Mercury. Again, I mentioned the national statistic, but this is the state statistic. As of late last year, the majority of the thousands of people detained by ICE in Virginia had no criminal histories. Now, Virginia legislature and governorship under Democratic control at the time when President Trump targeted Democratic-led states, immigration advocates argue, along with civil rights groups, the Commonwealth could become the next focal point of ICE enforcement, right? Even some Republican lawmakers suggest that Trump could retaliate against Virginia over Governor Spanberger's actions. Delegate Karen Hamilton, Republican out of Culpeper, speculated in a recent social media post that the president could withhold federal funding following Spanberger's previous ICE-related order, a move Youngkin once threatened against localities that declined to cooperate with ICE. Keep in mind, our former governor did the exact same thing. But when asked whether he believes Trump might retaliate, Senator Studevert said, quote, "We'll see," unquote. At the end of the day, he added, we know we have criminal, illegal aliens here in Virginia. We have federal law enforcement whose job is to identify, find, and deport these individuals. We've been working constructively with those federal partners in order to do that. But Governor Spanberger, meanwhile, said her order does not prohibit cooperation between state agencies and ICE under limited circumstances, such as participation in special task force or when ICE presents judicial warrants requesting assistance. That's a clear delineation, according to the governor. But taking Virginia law enforcement, state agency personnel, and basically giving them over to ICE is something that she said ends today. Well, one thing about doing the right thing, especially when you are put in a position by the people to do the right thing, it's always the right time to do the right thing. And even though individuals might retaliate, you stand on solid ground. But as always, we want to thank you for joining us for this series of our 2026 General Assembly session. Join us every week as we break down the General Assembly and the laws that impact us. Until next time, be good, be great, God bless, and we'll see you on next week.
Hi, I'm Carrie Washington, and you're listening to State of the Water with award-winning host Dr. Eric Claville.